Actors are a superstitious lot, probably because chance plays a big part in the success of a production of a company or of an actor, and because we're still a little closer than other people to the gypsies in the way we live and think. For instance, it's bad luck to have peacock feathers on stage, or say the last line of a play at rehearsals, or whistle in the dressing room, the one nearest the door gets fired, or sing God Save the Sovereign on a railway train. A Canadian company got wrecked that way. Shakespearean actors are no exceptions. They simply travel with a few extra superstitions, such as the one that forbids reciting the lines of the Three Witches, or anything from Macbeth for that matter, except at performances, rehearsals, and on other legitimate occasions. This might be a good rule for outsiders, too. Then there wouldn't be the endless flood of books with titles taken from the text of Macbeth. You know, Brief Candle, Tomorrow and Tomorrow, The Sound and the Fury, A Poor Player, All Our Yesterdays, and those are all just from one brief soliloquy. And our company, the governor's company, has a rule against the ghost in Hamlet dropping his greenish cheesecloth veil over his helmet-framed face until the very moment he makes each of his entrances. Hamlet's dead father mustn't stand veiled in the darkness of the wings. This last superstition commemorates something that happened not too long ago, an actual ghost story. Sometimes I think it's the greatest ghost story in the world, though certainly not from my way of telling it, which is gossipy and poor, but from the wonder blazing at its core. It's not only a true tale of the supernatural, but also very much a story about people, for after all, and before everything else, ghosts are people. The ghostly part of the story first showed itself in the tritest way imaginable. 3 of our actresses, meaning practically all the ladies in a Shakespearean company, took to having sessions with the Ouija board, in the hour before curtain time, and sometimes even during a performance, when they had long off-stage waits, and they became so wrapped up in it and conceited about it, and they squeaked so excitedly at the revelations which the planchette spelled out, and 3 or 4 times almost missed entrances because of it, that if the governor weren't such a tolerant commander-in-chief, he would have forbidden them to bring the board to the theater. I'm sure he was tempted to, and might have, except that Props pointed out to him that our 3 ladies probably wouldn't enjoy Ouija sessions one bit in the privacy of a hotel room, that much of the fun in operating a Ouija board is in having a half-exasperated, half-intrigued floating audience, and that when all is done, the basic business of all ladies is glamour, whether of personal charm or of actual witchcraft, since the word means both. Props, that is our property man, Billy Simpson, was fascinated by their obsession, as he is by any new thing that comes along, and might very well have broken our Shakespearean taboo by quoting the 3 witches about them, except that Props has no flair for Shakespearean speech at all, no dramatic ability whatsoever. In fact, he's the one person in our company who never acts even a bit part, or carries a mute spear on stage, though he has other talents that make up for this deficiency. He can throw together a papier-mâché bust of Pompey in 2 hours, or turn out a wooden prop dagger all silvery-bladed and hilt-gilded, or fix a zipper, and that's not all. As for myself, I was very irked at the ridiculous alphabet board, since it seemed to occupy most of Monica Singleton's spare time and satisfy all her hunger for thrills. I'd been trying to promote a romance with her. A long touring season becomes deadly and cold without some sort of heart tickle, and for a while I'd made progress. But after Ouija came along, I became a ridiculous Guildenstern, mooning after an unattainable, unseeing Ophelia, which were the parts I and she actually played in Hamlet. I cursed the idiot board with its childish corner pictures of grinning suns and smirking moons and windblown spirits, and I further alienated Monica by asking her why wasn't it called a 9-9 or a no-no board, ninny board, instead of a yes-yes board. Was that, I inquired, because all spiritualists are forever accentuating the positive and behaving like a pack of fawning yes-men? Yes, we're here. Yes, we're your Uncle Harry. Yes, we're happy on this plane. Yes, we have a doctor among us who'll diagnose that pain in your chest, and so on. Monica wouldn't speak to me for a week after that. I would have even been more depressed, except that Props pointed out to me that no flesh-and-blood man can compete with ghosts for a girl's affection, since ghosts, being imaginary, have all the charms and perfections a girl can dream of, but that all girls eventually tire of ghosts, or if their minds don't, their bodies do. This eventually did happen, thank goodness, in the case of Monica and me, though not until we'd had a grisly, mind-wrenching experience, a night of terrors before the nights of love. So Ouija flourished, and the governor and the rest of us put up with it one way or another, until there came that three-night stand in Wolverton, when its dismal, uncanny old theater tempted our three Ouija women to ask the board who was the ghost haunting the spooky place, and the swooping planchette spelled out the name S-H-A-K-E-S-P-E-A-R-E. But I am getting ahead of my story. I haven't introduced our company except for Monica, Props, and the governor, and I haven't identified the last of those three. We call Gilbert Usher the governor out of sheer respect and affection. He's about the last of the old actor-managers. He hasn't the name of Gielgud or Olivier or Evans or Richardson, but he spent most of a lifetime keeping Shakespeare alive, spreading that magical, a-religious gospel in the more remote counties and the dominions in the United States, like Benson once did. Our other actors aren't names at all. I refuse to tell you mine. But with the exception of myself, they're good troopers, or if they don't become that, the first season they drop out. Gruelingly long seasons, much uncomfortable traveling, and small profits are our destiny. This particular season had got to that familiar point where the plays are playing smoothly and everyone's a bit tireder than he realizes, and the restlessness sets in. Robert Dennis, our juvenile, was writing a novel of theatrical life, he said, mornings at the hotel, up at 7 to slave at it, our Robert claimed. Poor old Guthrie Boyd had started to drink again, and drink quite too much, after an abstemious 2 months that had astonished everyone. Francis Farley Scott, our leading man, had started to drop hints that he was going to organize a Shakespearean repertory company of his own next year, and he began to have conspiratorial conversations with Gertrude Granger, our leading lady, and to draw us furtively aside one by one to make us hypothetical offers, no exact salary named. F.F. is as old as the governor, who is our star, of course, and he has no talents at all except for self-infatuation and a somewhat grandiose yet impressive fashion of acting. He's portly like an opera tenor and quite bald, and he travels with an assortment of 32 pays, ranging from red to black, shot with silver, which he alternates with shameless abandon. They're for wear off stage, not on. It doesn't matter to him that the company knows all about his multicolored artificial toppings, for we're part of his world of illusion, and he's firmly convinced that the stage-struck local ladies he squires about never notice, or at any rate mind the deception. He once gave me a lecture on the subtleties of suiting the color of your hair to the lady you're trying to fascinate, her own age, hair color, and so on. Every year, F.F. plots to start a company of his own. It's a regular mid-season routine with him, and every year it comes to nothing, for he's as lazy and impractical as he is vain. Yet F.F. believes he could play any part in Shakespeare, or all of them at once in a pinch. Perhaps the only F.F. Scott company that would really satisfy him would be one in which he would be the only actor, a Shakespearean monologue. In fact, the one respect in which F.F. is not lazy is in his eagerness to double as many parts as possible in any single play. F.F.'s yearly plots never bother the governor a bit. He keeps waiting wistfully for F.F. to fix him with a hypnotic eye, and in a hoarse whisper ask him to join the Scott Company. And I, of course, was hoping that now at last Monica Singleton would stop trying to be the most exquisite ingenue that ever came tripping Shakespeare's way, rehearsing her parts even in her sleep, I guess, though I was miles from being in a position to know that for certain, and begin to take note, and not just advantage, of my devoted attentions. But then old Sybil Jameson brought the Ouija board, and Gertrude Granger dragooned an unwilling Monica into placing her fingertips on the planchette along with theirs, just for a lark. Next day, Gertrude announced to several of us in a hushed voice that Monica had the most amazing underdeveloped mediumistic talent she'd ever encountered, and from then on the girl was a Ouija addict. Poor, tight-drawn Monica. I suppose she had to explode out of her self-imposed Shakespearean discipline somehow, and it was just too bad it had to be the board instead of me. Though, come to think of it, I shouldn't have felt quite so resentful of the board, for she might have exploded with Robert Dennis, which would have been infinitely worse, though we were never quite sure of Robert's sex. For that matter, I wasn't sure of Gertrude's, and suffered agonies of uncertain jealousy when she captured my beloved. I was obsessed with the vision of Gertrude's bold knees pressing Monica's under the Ouija board, though with Sybil's bony ones for chaperones, fortunately. Francis Farley Scott, who was jealous too because this new toy had taken Gertrude's mind off their annual plottings, said rather spitefully that Monica must be one of those grabby girls who have to take command of whatever they get their fingers on, whether it's a man or a planchette. But Props told me he'd bet anything that Gertrude and Sybil had followed Monica's first random finger movements like the skillfulest dancers guiding a partner while seeming to yield in order to coax her into the business and make sure of their third. Sometimes I thought that FF was right, and sometimes Props, and sometimes I thought that Monica had a genuine supernatural talent, though I don't ordinarily believe in such things. And that last really frightened me, for such a person might give up live men for ghosts forever. She was such a sensitive, subtle, wraith-cheeked girl, and she could get so keyed up. And when she touched the planchette, her eyes got such an empty look, as if her mind had traveled down into her fingertips or out to the ends of time and space. And once, the three of them gave a character reading from the board that embarrassed me with its accuracy. The same thing happened to several other people in the company. Of course, as Props pointed out, actors can be pretty good character analysts whenever they stop being egomaniacs. After reading characters and foretelling the future for several weeks, our three weird sisters got interested in reincarnation and began asking the board and then telling us what famous or infamous people we'd been in past lives. Gertrude Granger had been Queen Boadicea, I wasn't surprised to hear. Sybil Jameson had been Cassandra, and Monica had once been Mad Queen Joanna of Castile, and more recently a prize hysterical patient of Janet at the Salpêtrière, touches that irritated and frightened me more than they should have. Billy Simpson, Props, had been an Egyptian silversmith under Queen Hatshepsut, and later a servant of Samuel Pepys. He heard this with a delighted chuckle. Guthrie Boyd had been the Emperor Claudius, and Robert Dennis had been Caligula. For some reason, I had been both John Wilkes Booth and Lambert Simnel, which irritated me considerably, for I saw no romance but only neurosis in assassinating an American president and dying in a burning barn, or impersonating the Earl of Warwick, pretending unsuccessfully to the British throne, being pardoned for it of all things, and spending the rest of my life as a scullion in the kitchen of Henry VII and his son. The fact that both Booth and Simnel had been actors of a poor sort, naturally irritated me the more. Only much later did Monica confess to me that the board had probably made those decisions because I had had such a tragic, dangerous, defeated look, a revelation that surprised and flattered me. Francis Farley Scott was flattered, too, to hear he had once been Henry VIII. He fancied all those wives, and he wore his golden blonde toupee after the show that night, until Gertrude and Sybil and Monica announced that the governor was a reincarnation of no less than William Shakespeare himself. That made FF so jealous that he instantly sat down at the prop table, grabbed a quill pen, and did an impromptu rendering of Shakespeare composing Hamlet's to-be or not-to-be soliloquy. It was an effective performance, though with considerably more frowning and eye-rolling and trying of lines for sound than I imagine Willie S. himself used originally. And when FF had finished, even the governor, who had been standing unobserved in the shadows beside Props, applauded with the latter. The governor kidded the pants off the idea of himself as Shakespeare. He said that if Willie S. were ever reincarnated, it ought to be as a world-famous dramatist, who was secretly in his spare time the world's greatest scientist and philosopher, and left clues to his identity in his mathematical equations. That way, he'd get his own back at Bacon, or rather the Baconians. Yet I suppose if you had to pick someone for a reincarnation of Shakespeare, Gilbert Usher wouldn't be a bad choice. Insofar as a star and director ever can be, the governor is gentle and self-effacing, as Shakespeare himself must have been, or else there would never have arisen that ridiculous Bacon, Oxford, Marlowe, Elizabeth, take-your-pick-who-wrote Shakespeare controversy. And the governor has a sweet melancholy about him, though he's handsomer and, despite his years, more athletic than one imagines Shakespeare being. And he's generous to a fault, especially where old actors who've done brave, fine things in the past are concerned. This season, his mistake in that last direction had been in hiring Guthrie Boyd to play some of the more difficult, older leading roles, including a couple FF usually handles, Brutus, Othello, and besides those, Duncan in Macbeth, Kent in King Lear, and the Ghost in Hamlet. Guthrie was a bellowing, hard-drinking bear of an actor, who had been a Shakespearean star in Australia and successfully smuggled some of his reputation west. He learned to moderate his bellowing, while his emotions were always simple and sincere, though explosive, and finally had even spent some years in Hollywood. But there his drinking caught up with him, probably because of the stupid film parts he got, and he failed 6 times over. His wife divorced him, his children cut themselves off. He married a starlet, and she divorced him. He dropped out of sight. Then, after several years, the governor ran into him. He had been resuscitating in Canada with a stubborn teetotal admirer. He was only a shadow of his former self, but there was some substance to the shadow, and he wasn't drinking. The governor decided to take a chance on him, although the company manager, Harry Grossman, was dead set against it. And during rehearsals in the first month or so of performances, it was wonderful to see how old Guthrie Boyd came back, exactly as if Shakespeare were the restorative medicine. It may be stuffy or sentimental of me to say so, but you know, I think Shakespeare is good for people. I don't know of an actor, except myself, whose character hasn't been strengthened and whose vision widened and charity quickened by working in the plays. I've heard that before Gilbert Usher became a Shakespearean, he was a more ruthlessly ambitious and critical man, not without malice, but the plays mellowed him as they've mellowed Prop's philosophy and given him a zest for life. Because of his contact with Shakespeare, Robert Dennis is a less strident and pettish swish, if he is one. Gertrude Granger's outbursts of cold rage have an undercurrent of queenly make-believe. And even Francis Farley Scott's grubby little seductions are probably kinder and less insultingly illusionary. In fact, I sometimes think that what civilized serenity the British people possess and what small but real ability to smile at themselves is chiefly due to their good luck in having had William Shakespeare born one of their company. But I was telling how Guthrie Boyd performed very capably those first weeks against the expectations of most of us, so that we almost quit holding our breaths or sniffing at his. His Brutus was workmanlike, his Kent quite fine, that bluff, rough, honest part suited him well, and he regularly got admiring notices for his ghost in Hamlet. I think his years of living death as a drinking alcoholic had given him an understanding of loneliness and frozen abilities and despair that he put to good use, probably unconsciously, in interpreting that small role. He was really a most impressive figure in the part, even just visually. The ghost's basic costume is simple enough: a big, all-enveloping cloak that brushes the ground cloth, a big, dull helmet with the tiniest battery light inside its peak to throw a faint green glow on the ghost's features, and over the helmet a veil of greenish cheesecloth that registers as mist to the audience. He wears a suit of stage armor under the cloak, but that's not important, and at a pinch he can do without it, for his cloak can cover his entire body. The ghost doesn't switch on his helmet light until he makes his entrance, for fear of its being glimpsed by an edge of the audience. And nowadays, because of that superstition or rule I told you about, he doesn't drop the cheesecloth veil until the last second either. But when Guthrie Boyd was playing the part, that rule didn't exist, and I have a vivid recollection of him standing in the wings, waiting to go on, a big, bearish, inscrutable figure about as solid and unsupernatural as a bushy 7-foot evergreen covered by a gray tarpaulin. But then when Guthrie would switch on the tiny light and stride smoothly and silently on stage, and his hollow, distant, tormented voice would boom out, there'd be a terrific shivery thrill, even for us backstage, as if we were listening to words that really had traveled across black, windy, infinite gulfs from the afterworld or the other side. At any rate, Guthrie was a great ghost, and adequate or a bit better than that in most of his other parts, for those first non-drinking weeks. He seemed very cheerful on the whole, modestly buoyed up by his comeback, though sometimes something empty and dead would stare for a moment out of his eyes, the old drinking alcoholic wondering what all this fatiguing sober nonsense was about. He was especially looking forward to our 3-night stand at Wolverton, although that was still 2 months in the future then. The reason was that both his children, married and with families now, of course, lived and worked at Wolverton, and I'm sure he set great store on proving to them in person his rehabilitation, figuring it would lead to a reconciliation and so on. But then came his first performance as Othello. The governor, although the star, always played Iago, an equal role, though not the title one. Guthrie was almost too old for Othello, of course, and besides that, his health wasn't good. The drinking years had taken their toll of his stamina, and the work of rehearsals and of first nights in 8 different plays after years away from the theater had exhausted him. But somehow the old volcano inside him got seething again, and he gave a magnificent performance. Next morning the papers raved about him, and one review rated him even better than the governor. That did it, unfortunately. The glory of his triumph was too much for him. The next night, Othello again, He was drunk as a skunk. He remembered most of his lines, though the governor had to throw him about every sixth one out of the side of his mouth. But he weaved and wobbled. He planked a big hand on the shoulder of every other character he addressed to keep from falling over, and he even forgot to put in his false teeth the first two acts, so that his voice was mushy. To cap that, he started really to strangle Gertrude Granger in the last scene until that rather brawny Desdemona, unseen by the audience, gave him a knee in the gut. Then, after stabbing himself, he flung the prop dagger high in the flies so that it came down with two lazy twists, and piercing the ground cloth, buried its blunt point deep in the soft wood of the stage floor, not 3 feet from Monica, who plays Iago's wife Emilia, and so was lying dead on the stage at that point in the drama, murdered by her villainous husband, and might have been dead for real if the dagger had followed a slightly different trajectory. Since a third performance of Othello was billed for the following night, the governor had no choice but to replace Guthrie with Francis Farley Scott, who did a good job for him of covering up his satisfaction at getting his old role back. F.F., always a plushy and lascivious-eyed Moor, also did a good job with the part, coming in that way without even a brush-up rehearsal, so that one critic, catching the first and third shows, marveled how we could change big roles at will, thinking we had done it solely to demonstrate our virtuosity. Of course, the governor read the riot act to Guthrie and carried him off to a doctor, who, without being prompted, threw a big scare into him about his drinking and his heart, so that he just might have recovered from his lapse, except that 2 nights later we did Julius Caesar, and Guthrie, instead of being satisfied with being workmanlike, decided to recoup himself with a really rousing performance. So he bellowed and groaned and bugged his eyes, as I suppose he had done in his palmiest Australian days. His optimistic self-satisfaction between scenes was frightening to behold. Not too terrible a performance, truly, but the critics all panned him, and one of them said, "Guthrie Boyd played Brutus, a bunch of vocal cords wrapped up in a toga." That tied up the package and knotted it tight. Thereafter, Guthrie was medium pie-eyed from morning to night, and often more than medium. The governor had to yank him out of Brutus, too, F.F. again replacing, but being the governor, he didn't sack him. He put him into a couple of bit parts, Montano and the soothsayer in Othello and Caesar, and let him keep on at the others, and he gave Joe Rubens and me, and sometimes props, the job of keeping an eye on the poor old sot, and making sure he got to the theater by the half hour, and if possible, not too plastered. Often he played the ghost of the Doge of Venice in his street clothes, under a cloak or scarlet robe, but he played them. And many were the nights Joe and I made the rounds of half the local bars before we corralled him. The governor sometimes refers to Joe Rubens and me in mild derision as the American element in his company, but just the same he depends on us quite a bit, and I certainly don't mind being one of his troubleshooters. It's a joy to serve him. All this may seem to contradict my statement about our getting to the point about this time where the plays were playing smoothly and the monotony setting in, but it doesn't really. There's always something going wrong in a theatrical company. Anything else would be abnormal, just as the Samoans say no party is a success until somebody's dropped a plate or spilled a drink or tickled the wrong woman. Besides, once Guthrie had got Othello and Brutus off his neck, he didn't do too badly. The little parts, and even Kent, he could play passively, whether drunk or sober. King Duncan, for instance, and the Doge and the Merchant are easy to play drunk because the actor always has a couple of attendants on either side of him who can guide his steps if he weaves and even hold him up if necessary, which can turn out to be an effective dramatic touch, registering as the infirmity of extreme age. And somehow Guthrie continued to give that same masterful performance as the ghost and get occasional notices for it. In fact, Sybil Jameson insisted he was a shade better in the ghost now that he was invariably drunk, which could have been true. And he still talked about the 3-night stand coming up in Wolverton, though now as often with gloomy apprehension as with proud fatherly anticipation. Well, the 3-night stand eventually came. We arrived at Wolverton on a non-playing evening. To the surprise of most of us, but especially Guthrie's, his son and daughter were there at the station to welcome him with their respective spouses, and all their children and numerous in-laws, and a great gaggle of friends. Their cries of greeting when they spotted him were almost an organized cheer, and I looked around for a brass band to strike up. I found out later that Sybil Jameson, who knew them, had been sending them all his favorable notices, so that they were eager as weasels to be reconciled with him and show him off as blatantly as possible. When he saw his children's and grandchildren's faces and realized the cries were for him, Old Guthrie got red in the face and beamed like the sun, and they closed in around him and carried him off in triumph for an evening of celebrations. Next day I heard from Sybil, whom they had carried off with him, that everything had gone beautifully. He had drunk like a fish, but kept marvelous control, so that no one but she noticed. And the warmth of the reconciliation of Guthrie to everyone, complete strangers included, had been wonderful to behold. Guthrie's son-in-law, a pugnacious chap, had got angry when he'd heard Guthrie wasn't to play Brutus the third night, and he declared that Gilbert Usher must be jealous of his magnificent father-in-law. Everything was forgiven 20 times over. They had even tried to put old Sybil to bed with Guthrie, figuring romantically, as people will about actors, that she must be his mistress. All this was very fine, and of course wonderful for Guthrie, and for Sybil too, in a fashion, yet I suppose the unrestrained night-long bash after 2 months of uninterrupted semi-controlled drunkenness was just about the worst thing anybody could have done to the old boy's sodden body and laboring heart. Meanwhile, on that first evening, I accompanied Joe Rubens and Props to the theater we were playing at Wolverton to make sure the scenery got stacked right and the costume trunks had all safely arrived and been stowed. Joe is our stage manager. Besides doing rough or Hebraic parts like Caliban and Tubal, he was a professional boxer in his youth and got his nose smashed crooked. Once I started to take boxing lessons from him, figuring an actor should know everything. But during the third lesson I walked into a gentle right cross, and although it didn't exactly stun me, there were bells ringing faintly in my head for 6 hours afterward, and I lived in a world of faerie, and that was the end of my fistic career. Joe is actually a most versatile actor. For instance, he understudies the governor in Macbeth, Lear, Iago, and of course Shylock, though his brutal moon face is against him, especially when his makeup doesn't include a beard. But he dotes on being genial. And in the States he often gets a job by day playing Santa Claus in big department stores during the month before Christmas. The Monarch was a cavernous old place, very grimy backstage, but with a great warren and dirty little dressing rooms and even a property room, shaped like an L, stage left. Its empty shelves were thick with dust. There hadn't been a show in the Monarch for over a year, I saw from the yellowing sheets thumbtacked to the callboard as I tore them off and replaced them with a simple black crayoned Hamlet. Tonight at 8:30. Then I noticed, by the cold, inadequate working lights, a couple of tiny dark shapes dropping down from the flies and gliding around in wide, swift circles, out into the house, too, since the curtain was up. Bats, I realized with a little start. The Monarch was really halfway through the Lich Gate. The bats would fit very nicely with Macbeth, I told myself, but not so well with a Merchant of Venice, while with Hamlet they should neither help nor hinder, provided they didn't descend in night fighter squadrons. It would be nice if they stuck to the ghost scenes. I'm sure the governor had decided we'd open at Wolverton with Hamlet so that Guthrie would have the best chance of being a hit in his children's home city. Billy Simpson, shoving his properties table into place just in front of the dismal L of the prop room, observed cheerfully, "It's a proper haunted house. The girls will find some rare ghosts here, I'll wager, if they work their board." Which turned out to be far truer than he realized at the time, I think. "Bruce," Joe Rubens called to me, "we better buy a couple of rat traps and set them out. There's something scuttling back of the drops." But when I entered the Monarch next night, well before the hour, by the creaky thick metal stage door, the place had been swept and tidied a bit. With the ground cloth down and the Hamlet set up, it didn't look too terrible, even though the curtain was still unlowered, dimly showing the house and its curves of empty seats and the 2 faint green exit lights with no one but myself to look at them. There was a little pool of light around the callboard stage right, and another glow the other side of the stage beyond the wings, and lines of light were showing around the edges of the door of the second dressing room next to the stars. I started across the dark stage, sliding my shoes softly so as not to trip over a cable or stage screw and brace, and right away I got the magic electric feeling I often do in an empty theater the night of a show. Only this time there was something additional, something that started a shiver crawling down my neck. It wasn't, I think, the thought of the bats that might now be swooping around me unseen, skirling their inaudibly shrill trumpet calls, or even of the rats that might be watching sequin-eyed from behind trunks and flats, although not an hour ago Joe had told me that the traps he had actually procured and set last night had been empty today. No, it was more as if all of Shakespeare's characters were invisibly there around me, all the infinite possibilities of a theater. I imagined Rosalind and Falstaff and Prospero standing arm in arm watching me with different smiles, and Caliban grinning down from where he silently swung in the flies. and side by side, but unsmiling and not arm in arm, Macbeth and Iago and Dick the Three-Eyes, Richard the Third, and all the rest of Shakespeare's myriad-minded good-evil crew. I passed through the wings opposite, and there in the second pool of light, Billy Simpson sat behind his table with the properties for Hamlet set out on it. The skulls, the foils, the lantern, the purses, the parchmenty letters, Ophelia's flowers, and all the rest. It was odd, Props having everything ready quite so early, and a bit odd, too, that he should be alone, for Props has the unactorish habit of making friends with all sorts of locals, such as policemen and porters and flower women and newsboys and shopkeepers and tramps who clean their indigent actors, and even inviting them backstage with him, a fracture of rules which the governor allows since Props is such a sensible chap. He has a great liking for people, especially low people, Props has, and for all the humble details of life. He'd make a good writer, I think, except for his utter lack of dramatic flair and story skill, a sort of prosiness that goes with his profession. And now he was sitting at his table, his stooped shoulders almost inside the doorless entry to the empty shelf prop room. No point in using it for a three-night stand, and he was gazing at me quizzically. He has a big forehead, the light was on that, and a tapering chin, that was in shadow, and rather large eyes, which were betwixt the light and the dark. Sitting there like that, he seemed to me for a moment, mostly because of the outspread props, I guess, like the midnight master of the show in the Rubaiyat, around whom all the rest of us move like shadow shapes. Usually he has a quick greeting for anyone, but tonight he was silent, and that added to the illusion. "Props," I said, "this theater's got a supernatural smell." His expression didn't change at that, but he solemnly sniffed the air in several little whiffles, adding up to one big inhalation, and as he did so he threw his head back, bringing his weakish chin into the light and shattering the illusion. "Dust," he said after a moment. "Dust and old plush and scenery water paint and sweat and drains and gelatin and grease paint and powder and the breath of whiskey. But the supernatural? No, I can't smell that. Unless—" And he sniffed again, but shook his head. I chuckled at his materialism, although that touch about whiskey did seem fanciful, since I hadn't been drinking and Props never does, and Guthrie Boyd was nowhere in evidence. Props has a mind like a notebook for sensory details, and for the minutiae of human habits, too. It was Props, for instance, who told me about the actual notebook in which John McCarthy, who would be playing Fortinbras and the Player King in a couple of hours, jots down the exact number of hours he sleeps each night and keeps totting them up, so he knows when he'll have to start sleeping extra hours to average the full 9 he thinks he must get each night to keep from dying. It was also Props who pointed out to me that FF is much more careless gumming his offstage toupees to his head than his theater wigs, a studied carelessness like that in tying a bow tie, he assured me. It indicated, he said, a touch of contempt for the whole offstage world. Props isn't only a detail worm, but it's perhaps because he is one that he has sympathy for all human hopes and frailties, even the most trivial, like my selfish infatuation with Monica. Now I said to him, "I didn't mean an actual smell, Billy, but back there just now I got the feeling anything might happen tonight." He nodded slowly and solemnly. With anyone but Props, I'd have wondered if he wasn't a little drunk. Then he said, "You were on a stage. You know, the science fiction writers are missing a bet there. We've got time machines right now. Theaters. Theaters are time machines and spaceships, too. They take people on trips through the future and the past and the elsewhere and the might have been. Yes, and if it's done well enough, give them glimpses of heaven and hell." I nodded back at him. Such grotesque fancies are the closest Props ever comes to escaping from prosiness. I said, "Well, let's hope Guthrie gets aboard the spaceship before the curtain upjets. Tonight we're depending on his children having the sense to deliver him intact, which, from what Sybil says about them, is not to be taken for granted." Props stared at me owlishly and slowly shook his head. "Guthrie got here about 10 minutes ago," he said, "and looking no drunker than usual." "That's a relief," I told him, meaning it. "The girls are having a Ouija session," he went on, as if he were determined to account for all of us from moment to moment. "They smelled the supernatural here just as you did, and they're asking the board to name the culprit." Then he stooped so that he looked almost hunchbacked and felt for something under the table. I nodded. I'd guessed the Ouija part from the lines of light showing around the door of Gertrude Granger's dressing room. Props straightened up, and he had a pint bottle of whiskey in his hand. I don't think a loaded revolver would have dumbfounded me as much. He unscrewed the top. "There's the governor coming in," he said tranquilly, hearing the stage door creak and evidently some footsteps my own ears missed. "That's 7 of us in the theater before the hour." He took a big, slow swallow of whiskey and recapped the bottle, as naturally as if it were a nightly action. I goggled at him without comment. What he was doing was simply unheard of for Billy Simpson. At that moment there was a sharp scream and a clatter of thin wood and something twangy and metallic falling and a scurry of footsteps. Our previous words must have cocked a trigger in me, for I was at Gertrude Granger's dressing-room door as fast as I could sprint, no worry this time about tripping over cables or braces in the dark. I yanked the door open, and there by the bright light of the bulbs framing the mirror were Gertrude and Sybil sitting close together, with the Ouija board face down on the floor in front of them, along with a flimsy wire-backed chair overturned. And pressing back into Gertrude's costumes, hanging on the rack across the little room, almost as if she wanted to hide behind them like under bedclothes, was Monica, pale and staring-eyed. She didn't seem to recognize me. The dark green, heavily brocaded costume Gertrude wears as the queen in Hamlet, into which Monica was chiefly pressing herself, accentuated her pallor. All 3 of them were in their street clothes. I went to Monica and put an arm around her and gripped her hand. It was cold as ice. She was standing rigidly. While I was doing that, Gertrude stood up and explained in rather haughty tones what I told you earlier, about their asking the board who the ghost was that was haunting the Monarch tonight, and the planchette spelling out SHAKESPEARE. "I don't know why it startled you so, dear," she ended crossly, speaking to Monica. "It's very natural his spirit should attend performances of his plays." I felt the slim body I clasped relax a little. That relieved me. I was selfishly pleased at having got an arm around it, even under such public and unamorous circumstances, while at the same time my silly mind was thinking that if Props had been lying to me about Guthrie Boyd having come in no more drunk than usual, this new Props who drank straight whiskey in the theater could lie too, I supposed. Why, then we could certainly use William Shakespeare tonight, since the ghost in Hamlet is the one part in all his plays Shakespeare himself is supposed to have acted on the stage. "I don't know why myself now," Monica suddenly answered from behind me, shaking her head as if to clear it. She became aware of me at last, started to pull away, then let my arm stay around her. The next voice that spoke was the governor's. He was standing in the doorway, smiling faintly, with Props peering around his shoulder. Props would be as tall as the governor if he ever straightened up, but his stoop takes almost a foot off his height. The governor said softly, a comic light in his eyes, "I think we should be content to bring Shakespeare's plays to life without trying for their author. It's hard enough on the nerves just to act Shakespeare." He stepped forward with one of his swift, naturally graceful movements, and kneeling on one knee, picked up the fallen board and planchette. "At all events, I'll take these in charge for tonight. Feeling better now, Miss Singleton?" he asked as he straightened and stepped back. "Yes, quite all right," she answered flusteredly, disengaging my arm and pulling away from me rather too quickly. He nodded. Gertrude Granger was staring at him coldly, as if about to say something scathing, but she didn't. Sybil Jameson was looking at the floor. She seemed embarrassed, yet puzzled too. I followed the governor out of the dressing-room and told him, in case Props hadn't, about Guthrie Boyd coming to the theater early. My momentary doubt of Props' honesty seemed plain silly to me now, although his taking that drink remained an astonishing riddle. Props confirmed me about Guthrie coming in, though his manner was a touch abstracted. The governor nodded his thanks for the news, then twitched a nostril and frowned. I was sure he had caught a whiff of alcohol and didn't know to which of us 2 to attribute it, or perhaps even to one of the ladies, or to an earlier passage of Guthrie this way. He said to me, "Would you come into my dressing-room for a bit, Bruce?" I followed him, thinking he'd picked me for the drinker and wondering how to answer. Best, perhaps, simply silently accept the fatherly lecture. But when he had turned on the lights and I had shut the door, his first question was, "You're attracted to Miss Singleton, aren't you, Bruce?" When I nodded abruptly, swallowing my morsel of surprise, he went on softly but emphatically, "Then why don't you quit hovering and playing Galahad and really go after her?" Ordinarily, I must appear to frown on affairs in the company, but in this case, it would be the best way I know of to break up those Ouija sessions, which are obviously harming the girl. I managed to grin and tell him I'd be happy to obey his instructions and do it entirely on my own initiative, too. He grinned back and started to toss the Ouija board on his couch, but instead put it and the planchette carefully down on the end of his long dressing table and put a second question to me. "What do you think of some of the stuff they're getting over the board, Bruce?" I said, "Well, that last one gave me a shiver, all right. I suppose because—" And I told him about sensing the presence of Shakespeare's characters in the dark. I finished. "But, of course, the whole idea is nonsense," and I grinned. He didn't grin back. I continued impulsively. "There was one idea they had a few weeks back that impressed me, though it didn't seem to impress you. I hope you won't think I'm trying to butter you up, Mr. Usher. I mean the idea of you being a reincarnation of William Shakespeare." He laughed delightedly and said, "Clearly you don't yet know the difference between a player and a playwright, Bruce. Shakespeare, striding about romantically with head thrown back, and twirling a sword and shaping his body and voice to every feeling handed him. No, I'll grant you he might have played the ghost. It's a part within the scope of an average writer's talents, requiring nothing more than that he stand still and sound off sepulchrally." He paused and smiled and went on. "No, there's only one person in this company who might be Shakespeare come again, and that's Billy Simpson. Yes, I mean props. He's a great listener, and he knows how to put himself in touch with everyone. And then he's got that rat-trap mind for every hue and scent and sound of life, inside or out of the mind. And he's very analytic. Oh, I know he's got no poetic talent, but surely Shakespeare wouldn't have that in every reincarnation. I'd think he'd need about a dozen lives in which to gather material for every one in which he gave it dramatic form. Don't you find something very poignant in the idea of a mute, inglorious Shakespeare spending whole, humble lifetimes collecting the necessary stuff for one great dramatic burst? Think about it someday." I was doing that already and finding it a fascinating fantasy. It crystallized so perfectly the feeling I'd got seeing Billy Simpson behind his properties table. And then props did have a high-foreheaded poet schoolmaster's face like that given Shakespeare in the posthumous engravings and woodcuts and portraits. Why, even their initials were the same. It made me feel strange. Then the governor put his third question to me. "He's drinking tonight, isn't he? I mean props, not Guthrie." I didn't say anything, but my face must have answered for me, at least to such a student of expressions as the governor, for he smiled and said, "You needn't worry. I wouldn't be angry with him. In fact, the only other time I know of that Props drank spirits by himself in the theater, I had a great deal to thank him for." His lean face grew thoughtful. "It was long before your time. In fact, it was the first season I took out a company of my own. I had barely enough money to pay the printer for the 3 sheets and get the first night curtain up. After that, it was touch and go for months. Then in mid-season, we had a run of bad luck. A 2-night heavy fog in one city, an influenza scare in another, Harvey Wilkins' Shakespearean troupe 2 weeks ahead of us in a third. And when in the next town we played, it turned out the advance sale was very light because my name was unknown there and the theater an unpopular one. I realized I'd have to pay off the company while there was still money enough to get them home, if not the scenery. That night I caught Props swigging, but I hadn't the heart to chide him for it. In fact, I don't think I'd have blamed anyone except perhaps myself for getting drunk that night. But then during the performance, the actors and even the union stage hands we travel with began coming to my dressing room by ones and twos, telling me they'd be happy to work without salary for another 3 weeks if I thought that might give us a chance of recouping. Well, of course, I grabbed at their offers, and we got a spell of brisk, pleasant weather, and we hit a couple of places starved for Shakespeare, and things worked out, even to paying all the back salary owed before the season was ended. Later on, I discovered it was Props who had put them all up to doing it." Gilbert Usher looked up at me, and one of his eyes was wet, and his lips were working just a little. "I couldn't have done it myself," he said, "for I wasn't the popular man with my company that first season. I'd been writing everyone much too hard and with nasty sarcasms, and I hadn't yet learned how to ask anyone for help when I really needed it. But Billy Simpson did what I couldn't, though he had to nerve himself for it with spirits. He's quick enough with his tongue in ordinary circumstances, as you know, particularly when he's being the friendly listener. But apparently when something very special is required of him, he must drink himself to the proper pitch. I'm wondering... His voice trailed off, and then he straightened up before his mirror and started to unknot his tie, and he said to me briskly, "Better get dressed now, Bruce, and then look in on Guthrie, will you?" My mind was churning some rather strange thoughts as I hurried up the iron stairs to the dressing room I shared with Robert Dennis. I got on my Guildenstern makeup and costume, finishing just as Robert arrived. As Laertes, Robert makes a late entrance, and so needn't hurry to the theater on Hamlet nights. Also, although we don't make a point of it, he and I spend as little time together in the dressing room as we can. Before going down, I looked into Guthrie Boyd's. He wasn't there, but the lights were on, and the essentials of the ghost's costume weren't in sight. Impossible to miss that big helmet, so I assumed he had gone down ahead of me. It was almost the half hour. The house lights were on, the curtain down, more stage lights on too, and quite a few of us about. I noticed that Props was back in the chair behind his table and not looking particularly different from any other night. Perhaps the drink had been a once-only aberration and not some symptom of a crisis in the company. I didn't make a point of hunting for Guthrie. When he gets costumed early, he generally stands back in a dark corner somewhere, wanting to be alone, perchance to sip. Aye, there's the rub. Or he visits with Sybil in her dressing room. I spotted Monica sitting on a trunk by the switchboard where backstage was brightest lit at the moment. She looked ethereal, yet spring-like in her blonde Ophelia wig and first costume, a pale green one. Recalling my happy promise to the governor, I bounced up beside her and asked her straight out about the Ouija business, pleased to have something to the point besides the plays to talk with her about, and really not worrying as much about her nerves as I suppose I should have. She was in a very odd mood, both agitated and abstracted, her gaze going back and forth between distant and near and very distant. My questions didn't disturb her at all. In fact, I got the feeling she welcomed them, yet she genuinely didn't seem able to tell me much about why she had been so frightened at the last name the board had spelled. She told me that she actually did get into a sort of dream state when she worked the board, and that she'd screamed before she'd quite comprehended what had shocked her so. Then her mind had blacked out for a few seconds, she thought. "One thing, though, Bruce," she said. "I'm not going to work the board any more. At least not when the three of us are alone like that." "That sounds like a wise idea," I agreed, trying not to let the extreme heartiness of my agreement show through. She stopped peering around as if for some figure to appear that wasn't in the play and didn't belong backstage, and she laid her hand on mine and said, "Thanks for coming so quickly when I went idiot and screamed." I was about to improve this opportunity by telling her that the reason I'd come so quickly was that she was so much in my mind, but just then Joe Rubens came hurrying up with the governor behind him in his Hamlet black to tell me that neither Guthrie Boyd nor his ghost costume was to be found anywhere in the theater. What's more, Joe had got the phone numbers of Guthrie's son and daughter from Sybil and rung them up. The one phone hadn't answered, while on the other a female voice, presumably a maid's, had informed him that everyone had gone to see Guthrie Boyd in Hamlet. Joe was already wearing his cumbrous chain mail armor for Marcellus, woven cord silvered, so I knew I was elected. I ran upstairs, and in the space of time it took Robert Dennis to guess my mission and advise me to try the dingiest bars first and have a drink or two myself in them, I'd put on my hat, overcoat, and wristwatch and left him. So garbed, and as usual nervous about people looking at my ankles, I sallied forth to comb the nearby bars of Wolverton. I consoled myself with the thought that if I found Hamlet's father's ghost drinking his way through them, no one would ever spare a glance for my own costume. Almost on the stroke of curtain, I returned, no longer giving a damn what anyone thought about my ankles. I hadn't found Guthrie or spoken to a soul who had seen a large male imbiber, most likely of Irish whiskey, in great cloak and antique armor, with perhaps some ghostly green light cascading down his face. Beyond the curtain, the overture was fading to its sinister close, and the backstage lights were all down, but there was an angry, hushed-voiced dispute going on stage left, where the ghost makes all his entrances and exits. Skipping across the dim stage in front of the blue-lit battlements of Elsinore, still in my hat and overcoat, I found the governor and Joe Rubens, and with them John McCarthy, all ready to go on, as the ghost in his Fortinbras armor with a dark cloak and some green gauze over it. But alongside them was Francis Farley Scott in a very similar get-up, no armor, but a big enough cloak to hide his king costume, and a rather more impressive helmet than John's. They were all very dim in the midnight glow, leaking back from the dimmed-down blue floods. The 5 of us were the only people I could see on this side of the stage. F.F. was arguing vehemently that he must be allowed to double the ghost with King Claudius because he knew the part better than John, and because, this was the important thing, he could imitate Guthrie's voice perfectly enough to deceive his children and perhaps save their illusions about him. Sybil had looked through the curtain hole and seen them and all of their yesterday crowd, with new recruits besides, occupying all of the second, third, and fourth rows center, chattering with excitement and beaming with anticipation. Harry Grossman had confirmed this from the front of the house. I could tell that the governor was vastly irked at F.F. and at the same time touched by the last part of his argument. It was exactly the sort of sentimental, heroic rationalization with which F.F. cloaked his insatiable yearnings for personal glory. Very likely he believed it himself. John McCarthy was simply ready to do what the governor asked him. He's an actor untroubled by inward urgencies, except for things like keeping a record of the hours he sleeps and each penny he spends, though with a natural facility for portraying on stage emotions, which he doesn't feel one iota. The governor shut up F.F. with a gesture and got ready to make his decision, but just then I saw that there was a 6th person on this side of the stage. Standing in the second wings beyond our group was a dark figure like a tarpaulined Christmas tree, topped by a big helmet of unmistakable general shape despite its veiling. I grabbed the governor's arm and pointed at it silently. He smothered a large curse and strode up to it and rasped, "Guthrie, you old son of a bee, can you go on?" The figure gave an affirmative grunt. Joe Rubens grimaced at me as if to say, "Show business," and grabbed a spear from the prop table and hurried back across the stage for his entrance as Marcellus, just before the curtain lifted and the first nervous, superbly atmospheric lines of the play rang out, loud at first, but then going low with unspoken apprehension. "Who's there? Hey, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself. Long live the king." "Bernardo? He? You come most carefully upon your hour. 'Tis now struck 12. Get thee to bed, Francisco. For this relief much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart. Have you had quiet guard? Not a mouse stirring." With a resigned shrug, John McCarthy simply sat down. F.F. did the same, though his gesture was clench-fisted and exasperated. For a moment it seemed to me very comic that 2 ghosts in Hamlet should be sitting in the wings watching a third perform. I unbuttoned my overcoat and slung it over my left arm. The ghost's first 2 appearances are entirely silent ones. He merely goes on stage, shows himself to the soldiers, and comes off again. Nevertheless, there was a determined little ripple of hand-clapping from the audience. The second, third, and fourth rows center greeting their patriarchal hero, it seemed likely. Guthrie didn't fall down at any rate, and he walked reasonably straight, an achievement perhaps rating applause. If anyone out there knew the degree of intoxication Guthrie was probably burdened with at this moment, a cask-bellied old man of the sea on his back. The only thing out of normal was that he had forgotten to turn on the little green light in the peak of his helmet, an omission that hardly mattered, certainly not on this first appearance. I hurried up to him when he came off and told him about it in a whisper as he moved off toward a dark backstage corner. I got in reply, through the inscrutable green veil, an exhalation of whiskey and 3 affirmative grunts. 1, that he knew it, 2, that the light was working, 3, that he'd remember to turn it on next time. Then the scene had ended, and I darted across the stage as they changed to the room of state set. I wanted to get rid of my overcoat. Joe Rubens grabbed me about Guthrie's green light not having been on, and I told him that was all taken care of. "Where the hell was he all the time we were hunting for him?" Joe asked me. "I don't know," I answered. By that time, the second scene was playing, with F.F., his ghost-covering shed, playing the king as well as he always does. It's about his best part. And Gertrude Granger looking very regal beside him as the queen, her namesake, while there was another flurry of applause, more scattered this time, for the governor in his black doublet and tights beginning about his 700th performance of Shakespeare's longest and meatiest role. Monica was still sitting on the trunk by the switchboard, looking paler than ever under her makeup, it seemed to me, and I folded my overcoat and silently persuaded her to use it as a cushion. I sat beside her, and she took my hand, and we watched the play from the wings. After a while, I whispered to her, giving her hand a little squeeze. "Feeling better now?" She shook her head. Then, leaning toward me, her mouth close to my ear, she whispered rapidly and unevenly, as if she just had to tell someone, "Bruce, I'm frightened. There's something in the theater. I don't think that was Guthrie playing the ghost." I whispered back. Sure it was. I talked with him. Did you see his face? She asked. No, but I smelled his breath, I told her and explained to her about his forgetting to turn on the green light. I continued. Francis and John were both ready to go on as the ghost, though, until Guthrie turned up. Maybe you glimpsed one of them before the play started, and that gave you the idea it wasn't Guthrie. Sybil Jamieson in her player costume looked around at me warningly. I was letting my whispering get too loud. Monica put her mouth so close that her lips for an instant brushed my ear, and she mouse-whispered, I don't mean another person playing the ghost. Not that exactly. Bruce, there's something in the theater. You've got to forget that Ouija nonsense, I told her sharply. And buck up now, I added, for the curtain had just gone down on scene 2, and it was time for her to get on stage for her scene with Laertes and Polonius. I waited until she was launched into it, speaking her lines brightly enough, and then I carefully crossed the stage behind the backdrop. I was sure there was no more than nerves and imagination to her notions, though they had raised shivers on me, but just the same I wanted to speak to Guthrie again and see his face. When I had completed my slow trip, you have to move rather slowly so the drop won't ripple or bulge, I was dumbfounded to find myself witnessing the identical backstage scene that had been going on when I'd got back from my tour of the bars. Only now there was a lot more light, because the scene being played on stage was a bright one. And Props was there behind his table watching everything like the spectator he basically is. But beyond him were Francis Farley Scott and John McCarthy in their improvised ghost costumes again, and the governor and Joe were with them, all of them carrying on that furious lip-reader's argument, now doubly hushed. I didn't have to wait to get close to them to know that Guthrie must have disappeared again. As I made my way toward them, watching their silent antics, my silly mind became almost hysterical with the thought that Guthrie had at last discovered that invisible hole every genuine alcoholic wishes he had, into which he could decorously disappear and drink during the times between his absolutely necessary appearances in the real world. As I neared them, Donald Fryer, our Horatio, came from behind me, having made the trip behind the backdrop faster than I had, to tell the governor in hushed gasps that Guthrie wasn't in any of the dressing rooms or anywhere else stage right. Just at that moment, the bright scene ended. The curtain came down, the drapes before which Ophelia and the others had been playing swung back to reveal again the battlements of Elsinore, and the lighting shifted back to the midnight blue of the first scene, so that for the moment it was hard to see at all. I heard the governor say decisively, "You play the ghost," his voice receding as he and Joe and Don hurried across the stage to be in place for their proper entrance. Seconds later there came the dull, soft hiss of the main curtain opening, and I heard the governor's taut, resonant voice saying, "The air bites shrewdly. It is very cold." And Don responding as Horatio with, "It is a nipping and an eager air." By that time I could see again well enough, see Francis Farley Scott and John McCarthy moving side by side toward the back wing, through which the ghost enters. They were still arguing in whispers. The explanation was clear enough. Each thought the governor had pointed at him in the sudden darkness, or possibly, in F.F.'s case, was pretending he so thought. For a moment the comic side of my mind, grown a bit hysterical by now, almost collapsed me with the thought of twin ghosts entering the stage side by side. Then once again, history still repeating itself, I saw beyond them that other, bulkier figure with the unmistakable shrouded helmet. They must have seen it too, for they stopped dead just before my hands touched the shoulder of each of them. I circled quickly past them and reached out my hands to put them lightly on the third figure's shoulders, intending to whisper, "Guthrie, are you okay?" It was a very stupid thing for one actor to do to another, startling him just before his entrance, but I was made thoughtless by the memory of Monica's fears and by the rather frantic riddle of where Guthrie could possibly have been hiding. But just then Horatio gasped, "Look, my lord, it comes!" And Guthrie moved out of my light grasp onto the stage without so much as turning his head, and leaving me shaking because where I'd touched the rough buckram-braced fabric of the ghost's cloak, I'd felt only a kind of insubstantiality beneath instead of Guthrie's broad shoulders. I quickly told myself that this was because Guthrie's cloak had stood out from his shoulders and his back as he had moved. I had to tell myself something like that. I turned around. John McCarthy and F.F. were standing in front of the dark prop table, and by now my nerves were in such a state that their paired forms gave me another start. But I tiptoed after them into the downstage wings and watched the scene from there. The governor was still on his knees with his sword held hilt up like a cross, doing the long speech that begins, "Angels and ministers of grace defend us." And of course the ghost had his cloak drawn around him so you couldn't see what was under it, and the little green light still wasn't lit in his helmet. Tonight the absence of that theatric touch made him a more frightening figure, certainly to me, who wanted so much to see Guthrie's ravaged old face and be reassured by it. Though there was still enough comedy left in the ragged edges of my thoughts that I could imagine Guthrie's pugnacious son-in-law whispering angrily to those around him that Gilbert Usher was so jealous of his great father-in-law that he wouldn't let him show his face on the stage. Then came the transition to the following scene, where the ghost has led Hamlet off alone with him, just a 5-second complete darkening of the stage, while a scrim is dropped. And at last the ghost spoke those first lines of, "Mark me," and "My hour is almost come, when I to sulphurous and tormenting flames must render up myself." If any of us had any worries about the ghost blowing his lines or slurring them drunkenly, they were taken care of now. Those lines were delivered with the greatest authority and effect, and I was almost certain that it was Guthrie's rightful voice. At least, I was at first, but doing an even better job than the good one he had always done of getting the effect of distance and otherworldliness and hopeless alienation from all life on earth. The theater became silent as death, if at the same time I could imagine the soft pounding of 1,000 hearts, thousands of shivers crawling, and I knew that Francis Farley Scott, whose shoulder was pressed against mine, was trembling. Each word the ghost spoke was like a ghost itself, mounting the air and hanging poised for an impossible extra instant before it faded toward eternity. Those great lines came. "I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night." And just at that moment, the idea came to me that Guthrie Boyd might be dead, that he might have died and be lying unnoticed somewhere between his children's home and the theater, no matter what props had said or the rest of us had seen, and that his ghost might have come to give a last performance. And on the heels of that chivalry impossibility came the thought that similar and perhaps even eerier ideas must be frightening Monica. I knew I had to go to her. So while the ghost's words swooped and soared in the dark, marvelous black-plumed birds, I again made that nervous cross behind the backdrop. Everyone stage right was standing as frozen and absorbed, motionless loomings, as I'd left John and F.F. I spotted Monica at once. She had moved forward from the switchboard and was standing crouched a little by the big floodlight that throws some dimmed blue on the backdrop and across the back of the stage. I went to her just as the ghost was beginning his exit stage left, moving backward along the edge of the light from the flood, but not quite in it, and reciting more lonelily and eerily than I'd ever heard them before those memorable last lines. "Fare thee well at once. The glowworm shows the matin to be near, and 'gins to pale his ineffectual fire. Adieu, adieu, Hamlet, remember me." 1 second passed, then another, and then there came 2 unexpected bursts of sound at the same identical instant. Monica screamed, and a thunderous applause started out front, touched off by Guthrie's people, of course, but this time swiftly spreading to all the rest of the audience. I imagine it was the biggest hand the ghost ever got in the history of the theater. In fact, I never heard of him getting a hand before. It certainly was a most inappropriate place to clap, however much the performance deserved it. It broke the atmosphere and the thread of the scene. Also, it drowned out Monica's scream so that only I and a few of those behind me heard it. At first, I thought I'd made her scream by touching her as I had Guthrie, suddenly, like an idiot, from behind. But instead of shrinking or dodging away, she turned and clung to me, and kept clinging even after I'd drawn her back, and Gertrude Granger and Sybil Jameson had closed in to comfort her and hush her gasping sobs and try to draw her away from me. By this time, the applause was through, and the governor and Don and Joe were taking up the broken scene and knitting together its finish as best they could, while the floods came up little by little, changing to rosy to indicate dawn breaking over Elsinore. Then Monica mastered herself and told us in quick whispers what had made her scream. The ghost, she said, had moved for a moment into the edge of the blue floodlight, and she had seen for a moment through his veil, and what she had seen had been a face like Shakespeare's. Just that and no more, except that at the moment when she told us, later she became less certain, she was sure it was Shakespeare himself and no one else. I discovered then that when you hear something like that, you don't exclaim or get outwardly excited, or even inwardly exactly. It rather shuts you up. I know I felt at the same time extreme awe and a renewed irritation at the Ouija board. I was deeply moved, yet at the same time pettishly irked, as if some vast adult creature had disordered the toy world of my universe. It seemed to hit Sybil and even Gertrude the same way. For the moment we were shy about the whole thing, and so in her way was Monica, and so were the few others who had overheard in part or all what Monica had said. I knew we were going to cross the stage in a few more seconds when the curtain came down on that scene, ending the first act, and stage lights came up. At least I knew that I was going across, yet I wasn't looking forward to it. When the curtain did come down, with another round of applause from out front, and we started across, Monica beside me with my arms still tight around her, there came a choked-off male cry of horror from ahead to shock and hurry us. I think about a dozen of us got stage left about the same time, including, of course, the governor and the others who had been on stage. FF and Props were standing inside the doorway to the empty prop room and looking down into the hidden part of the L. Even from the side, they both looked pretty sick. Then FF knelt down and almost went out of view, while Props hunched over him with his natural stoop. As we craned around Props for a look, I among the first, just beside the governor, we saw something that told us right away that this ghost wasn't ever going to be able to answer that curtain call they were still fitfully clapping for out front, although the house lights must be up by now for the first intermission. Guthrie Boyd was lying on his back in his street clothes. His face looked gray, the eyes staring straight up. Swirled beside him lay the ghost's cloak and veil and the helmet and an empty fifth of whiskey. Between the two conflicting shocks of Monica's revelation and the body in the prop room, my mind was in a useless state, and from her helpless, incredulous expression, I knew Monica felt the same. I tried to put things together, and they wouldn't fit anywhere. FF looked up at us over his shoulder. "He's not breathing," he said. "I think he's gone." Just the same, he started loosing Boyd's tie and shirt and pillowing his head on the cloak. He handed the whiskey bottle back to us through several hands, and Joe Rubens got rid of it. The governor sent out front for a doctor, and within 2 minutes Harry Grossman was bringing us one from the audience who had left his seat number and bag at the box office. He was a small man. Guthrie would have made two of him, and a bit awestruck I could see, though holding himself with greater professional dignity because of that, as we made way for him and then crowded in behind. He confirmed FF's diagnosis by standing up quickly after kneeling only for a few seconds where FF had. Then he said hurriedly to the governor, as if the words were being surprised out of him against his professional caution, "Mr. Usher, if I hadn't heard this man giving that great performance just now, I'd think he'd been dead for an hour or more." He spoke low, and not all of us heard him, but I did, and so did Monica. And there was shock 3 to go along with the other two, raising in my mind for an instant the grisly picture of Guthrie Boyd's spirit or some other entity willing his dead body to go through with that last performance. Once again, I unsuccessfully tried to fumble together the parts of this night's mystery. The little doctor looked around at us slowly and puzzledly. He said, "I take it he just wore the cloak over his street clothes?" He paused. Then, "He did play the ghost?" he asked us. The governor and several others nodded, but some of us didn't at once, and I think FF gave him a rather peculiar look, for the doctor cleared his throat and said, "I'll have to examine this man as quickly as possible in a better place and light. Is there—" The governor suggested the couch in his dressing room, and the doctor designated Joe Rubens and John McCarthy and Francis Farley Scott to carry the body. He passed over the governor, perhaps out of awe, but Hamlet helped just the same, his black garb most fitting. It was odd the doctor picked the older men. I think he did it for dignity. And it was odder still that he should have picked two ghosts to help carry a third, though he couldn't have known that. As the designated ones moved forward, the doctor said, "Please stand back, the rest of you." It was then that the very little thing happened which made all the pieces of this night's mystery fall into place, for me, that is, and for Monica, too, judging from the way her hand trembled in and then tightened around mine. We had been given the key to what had happened. I won't tell you what it was until I've knit together the ends of the story. The second act was delayed perhaps a minute, but after that we kept to schedule, giving a better performance than usual. I never knew the graveyard scene to carry so much feeling, or the bit with Yorick's skull to be so poignant. Just before I made my own first entrance, Joe Rubens snatched off my street hat. I'd had it on all this while, and I played all of Guildenstern wearing a wristwatch, though I don't imagine anyone noticed. FF played the ghost as an offstage voice when he makes his final brief appearance in the closet scene. He used Guthrie's voice to do it, imitating him very well. It struck me afterward as ghoulish, but right. Well, before the play ended, the doctor had decided he could say that Guthrie had died of a heart seizure, not mentioning the alcoholism. The minute the curtain came down on the last act, Harry Grossman informed Guthrie's son and daughter and brought them backstage. They were much moved, though hardly deeply smitten, seeing they had been out of touch with the old boy for a decade. However, they quickly saw it was a grand and solemn occasion and behaved accordingly, especially Guthrie's pugnacious son-in-law. Next morning, the two Wolverton papers had headlines about it, and Guthrie got his biggest notices ever in The Ghost. The strangeness of the event carried the item around the world, a 6-line filler capturing the mind for a second or two, about how a once-famous actor had died immediately after giving a performance as the ghost in Hamlet, though in some versions, of course, it became Hamlet's ghost. The funeral came on the afternoon of the third day, just before our last performance in Wolverton, and the whole company attended along with Guthrie's children's crowd and other Wolvertonians. Old Sybil broke down and sobbed. Yet, to be a bit callous, it was a neat thing that Guthrie died where he did, for it saved us the trouble of having to send for relatives and probably take care of the funeral ourselves. And it did give old Guthrie a grand finish, with everyone outside the company thinking him a hero martyr to the motto, "The show must go on." And of course we knew, too, that in a deeper sense, he had really been that. We shifted around in our parts and doubled some to fill the little gaps Guthrie had left in the plays, so that the governor didn't have to hire another actor at once. For me, and I think for Monica, the rest of the season was very sweet. Gertrude and Sybil carried on with the Ouija sessions alone. And now I must tell you about the very little thing that gave Monica and me a satisfying solution to the mystery of what had happened that night. You'll have realized that it involved props. Afterward, I asked him straight out about it, and he shyly told me that he really couldn't help me there. He'd had this unaccountable devilish compulsion to get drunk, and his mind had blanked out entirely from well before the performance until he found himself standing with FF over Guthrie's body at the end of the first act. He didn't remember the Ouija scare or a word of what he had said to me about theaters and time machines, or so he always insisted. FF told us that after the ghost's last exit, he had seen him, very vaguely in the dimness, lurch across backstage into the empty prop room, and that he and Props had found Guthrie lying there at the end of the scene. I think the queer look FF, the old reality-fuddling rogue, gave the doctor was to hint to him that he had played the ghost, though that wasn't something I could ask him about. But the very little thing. When they were picking up Guthrie's body and the doctor told the rest of us to stand back, Props turned as he obeyed and straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Monica and me, or rather a little over our heads. He appeared compassionate, yet smilingly serene as always, and for a moment transfigured, as if he were the eternal observer of the stage of life and this little tragedy were only part of an infinitely vaster, endlessly interesting pattern. I realized at that instant that Props could have done it, that he had very effectively guarded the doorway to the empty prop room during our searches, that the ghost's costume could be put on or off in seconds, though Props' shoulders wouldn't fill the cloak like Guthrie's, and that I had never once before or during the play seen him and the ghost at the same time. Yes, Guthrie had arrived a few minutes before me, and died, and Props, nerved to it by drink, had covered for him. While Monica, as she told me later, knew at once that here was the great broad face she had glimpsed for a moment through the greenish gauze. Clearly there had been 4 ghosts in Hamlet that night. John McCarthy, Francis Farley Scott, Guthrie Boyd, and the 4th who had really played the role. Mentally blacked out or not, knowing the lines from buried memories of times he had taken the role in the days of Queen Elizabeth I, Billy or Willie Simpson, or simply Willie S., had played the ghost, a good trooper responding automatically to an emergency.